Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and this is part 56 in a 10-part video series in which we are learning how to automate using vRealize Orchestrator. If you haven't already seen the previous two videos, I suggest you go back to part 54, watch that one, watch 55, then come back here. Alright, so as you can see here in this particular video, what we're going to be talking about is how to decide whether to use an output parameter or an attribute within your workflow. And to get the ball rolling here, the first flowchart that I'm going to show you here is, as I describe it in the title, is for beginners. If you're brand new to vRealize Orchestrator and you're asking yourself, as you write your workflow, should I create an output parameter? If the answer is no, then go ahead and create yourself an attribute. Go to the General tab, create an attribute, boom, you're done. But when my experience with beginners is that there tends to be an understandable tendency to shy away from using attributes. Perhaps it's because the name attributes is unfamiliar, sounds a little scary, so most beginners will automatically respond to this question by saying, oh no, I shouldn't create an attribute because I don't know what that is. And so I'll just create this nice, safe sounding thing called an output parameter. Well, what I tell my beginner students is that if you think that, yes, I should create an output parameter, then don't. Or as I like to put it in the classroom, I always tell my students on day one of class that I have a rule on day one of class. If you think you should create an output parameter, don't. Create an attribute instead. And I just let my students go with that basic rule, again, for about the first day of class. I promise them I'll come up with a better rule, a more nuanced rule, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But in the beginning, as an Orchestrator developer who's brand new to this Orchestrator workflow development thing, every time you think to create an output parameter, you should probably create an attribute instead. All right, let's move on. As you can see here, the following flowchart that I'm going to show you here is more nuanced. This flowchart shows how I look at the question of whether to create output parameters or attributes after 10 plus years of working in Orchestrator. So when I'm writing an Orchestrator workflow and I ask myself whether I should create an output parameter or an attribute, the first question I ask myself is, should the caller of my workflow, whoever that is or whatever that is, should the caller of my workflow need to see the value of the variable I'm working with? If the workflow caller does not need to see the value of my variable, then I create an attribute. So I go to the General tab and create an attribute, because that way I'm not clogging up my workflow with a bunch of unnecessary output parameters that might confuse the caller of the workflow. On the other hand, if the workflow caller does need to see the value, then ultimately I'm going to need an output parameter. But even though the workflow caller needs to see the value of the particular variable, that doesn't mean I'm automatically going to create an output parameter. Instead, I'm going to ask myself another question, which is, do I need to see the value of the variable from within my workflow? So do I, not the person or the thing calling the workflow, but do I, the workflow developer, need to see, not change, but do I need to see what's in the value of that variable within the workflow itself? If the answer is no, then I will create an output parameter. Again, this has the advantage of keeping things decluttered. By creating an output parameter, that will be one more output parameter that the caller sees, but by creating an output parameter within my workflow, I'm keeping things decluttered by not creating additional variables that I don't need. Continuing on here, if the workflow caller does need to see the value of the variable, and I, the developer of the workflow, also need to see the value of the variable, then what I'm going to do is create an attribute. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is if I instead create an output parameters have write-only permissions on them. While I can change the value of an output parameter, I cannot see what's in it. So if I create an output parameter, I won't be able to satisfy the need to see the value of the variable within the workflow. So instead, I'll create an attribute. Attributes are read-write, which means I will be able to, just like an output parameter, I will be able to change the value of the attribute. But because I've got read permission on the attribute, I can also see what's in the attribute from within any schema element I want to within my Orchestrator workflow. So again, if the workflow caller needs to see the value, and I, the developer of the workflow, also need to see the value, then I need to create an attribute. But at this point, if I'm using an attribute, the caller of the workflow cannot see the value of the variable. So ultimately what I'm going to need to do at some point, presumably as the very last schema element in the workflow, is I'm going to need to add a schema element, usually a scriptable task, that will copy the attribute that I've been using and copy that attribute into an output parameter. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about in the next video. So this last box here is the whole subject matter of the next video, in which I'm going to talk about some common design patterns in vRealize Orchestrator workflows and how they apply to this whole issue of input parameters, output parameters, and attributes. So I'll see you in the next video.